This is the new border, or one of the new borders that I've popped in this year. I started the work in actually the end of January because I was just itching to get out in the garden. And one of the first things that I've planted this year was this little rhododendron. It's a pink rhododendron. I don't have a name for it because I got it. It was literally just a cutting and it's grown huge. I nurtured it last year. I fed it well. I pinched it off. And it's 4 times the size that it was when I first bought it. So really, really thrilled with that. I actually have a few plants that I've purchased last season, as cuttings really. And I've grown them on, and I think this is about the best. But I always had it in mind that I would be popping this rhododendron into the border here. Rhododendrons are acidic plants. So I've used ericaceous compost and I've been feeding it on seaweed mix and it is doing really well. I'm really glad now that I popped this border in because I've enjoyed planting it up. Although the original idea of this border, I should have been having a ton of topsoil delivered. But who knew that we were going to be in the position we are with lockdown? So that kind of went out the window. So what I've actually had to do, I dug it over once, turned all the turf over, hoping that it would rot away, and I was then going to put topsoil on top. I've done that before and it works really well and it kind of feeds the soil. I have heavy clay soil and it tends to do it a lot of good. So what I actually had to do this year was take all the turf back up again, pull it up. I dug down 2-3 feet. I then buried all of the turf and covered it over. Well, it certainly aerated the clay very well. I buried the turf, I put the clay back on, I chopped it up, turned it over. It was really hard work, but I'm liking the results of it. The only area I didn't do was this small area here. I might be really lazy actually, and I might throw some mulch on that as the season gets going and just let that rot down and do its own thing towards next year. I do like adding mulch to this clay soil anyway because it is a good improver. This fuchsia here is a hardy Alice Hoffman it's called. And I've got another pot here and they're here in case I decide to plant them in this area. But I'm really not sure yet. I may well change my mind. And just last week I planted these. They're Eryngium sea holly. It's the first time that I've tried to grow them, and I've grown them from bare root and they've actually grown incredibly well. The only problem is they look absolutely nothing like what I thought they would look like. However, I did check with someone that's in the know, and from a reliable source I've been told that the leaf will change, so hopefully they will start to resemble sea holly more so. This is going to be really interesting because I've never handled these plants before. And about 10 days ago, I transplanted my Astilbe that you can see here. These have done so well. I kind of had to rescue them last year. They're just coming into bud and they look beautiful. I planted these completely incorrectly last year. I tried to research them, but I popped them in the wrong spot, and within a couple of weeks, they just dried out really quickly, and they still look pretty actually, even when the flowers were dry. But it was such a shame, so I quickly transplanted them last year, and I popped them into the darkest, dankest corner that I had. It saved the plant, however, the flowers were over, so I just had the pretty foliage last year. But this year, I've moved them here. This is the dampest spot that I have. And actually, if you look at the leaf here, when these first came through, they were very red. And I didn't really know what to expect there. There's a little bit of the red left there. They've turned to this lush green. But it's absolutely loaded with buds. So maybe I'm going to get my rewards for my hard work this year and have lots and lots of flowers. And hopefully I'll be able to divide these again next year. I'd like to fill this small area. Here are a few of my hostas. I have 3 hostas here that I actually had originally dotted around the garden, but this year's kind of been a sort out. With popping in the new border, it's enabled me to change little areas, and I wanted to have a hosta bed. This guy is huge. He's about 5-6 years old, and I'm looking forward to him coming up. So this little guy I rescued, and these other 2, they came from bulbs, so unfortunately I don't actually have a name for these. But they're doing very well actually, and I'm sure I have another one somewhere, but I haven't found it yet. It's somewhere in the borders amongst everything else. The Skinnier was planted last year, and here's my camellia, which has been in a few years, and one of my favourite plants, my beautiful Azalea. I absolutely love and adore this plant. When it comes into flower, it's absolutely stunning. It's bright pink. Just at the base of the Azalea, I've literally just divided this plant. It grew into quite a large plant last year and it looked really pretty, and I decided last year that I'd like to spread it around the base further. Geum, totally tangerine, such a gorgeous prolific flowerer. It flowered last year from May right through till September. I've successfully divided it into 3 parts and it looks really good, and then I found a tiny baby one here, so I'm going to keep an eye on this and see how well that grows. That would be a bonus. This was the main part of the plant and it's already in flower. The orange looks stunning against the pink of the Azalea. The buds are just starting to open up slightly. So I'm hoping the weather stays good, because very often the weather turns around the time that this Azalea opens and often kind of really batters the flowers. There's one opening up just there. Absolutely gorgeous. When they both come into full bloom, the 2 colours, they clash but actually look really good together. Gorgeous. This is another part of the new border that I added earlier this year. I transplanted the Skinnier early days as soon as it was all turned over and ready for planting. Love the Skinnier, and that's grown a lot from last year actually when I first planted it. The 2 other plants that are in here so far are alströmerias, and I can't actually remember what they are. I didn't label them last year. The larger one on the left I think is Neveo. It's a beautiful colour. And the smaller one here on the right I think is one called Mulan. This one didn't grow amazingly well last year. It seemed to struggle, which is unusual for alströmerias. They're usually great growers. Here's the border that I've added to the front garden this year, and I started this a bit later than the other 2, so it was a little bit more difficult to dig over, but it's looking okay now considering I couldn't get my topsoil to top it off. And so far I've planted, here's a set of pinks that I purchased. I've had them about 2 years in a pot, and just in this corner here, this is Euonymus Emerald Gaiety, which I love the colours on this variegated plant. It should flower. It didn't flower last year, and it isn't showing any signs this year. And just here we have Sempervivens, which I took from my trough and popped in here. This is more of an experiment to see how this guy does, because this front gets full sun all day and it does get quite dry, so I'm just popping that in there to see how it goes, because I'd like to plant a sedum in between the lavenders that I've planted here and just let the sedum grow, but it depends on how the ground goes. This is a Ceanothus that I potted up last year. It's one of my small purchases that I've grown on, and this one doesn't grow too high. It tends to grow wider, and I think it's called Yankee. And this hydrangea was already here. There were 2 plants in here just with a little square bed cut out around them. And this hydrangea started out life in the back garden quite a few years ago. And I transplanted this. It's been in the front border maybe 4 years or so and tends to do quite well. I've popped a few little forget-me-nots in here, but they're going over a bit now. And here's a fuchsia that I grew on from last year. I'm so grateful for these projects from last year. And here's my Escalonia apple blossom. This hasn't flowered yet. It's in its 2nd year, and I've taken it from a pot. And it was doing quite well, and it's quite happy in there. So I'm just hoping that this shrub develops as well and flourishes as well in the border here. It's sitting at the side of my peony, and this plant means so much to me. There's kind of a story behind it. I discovered this poking through the grass about 6 years ago, and it turns out this plant, peonies are known for being able to survive for like 100 years. They're vigorous plants that, if well looked after, can last for many, many years. Anyway, it turns out this plant originally was in my grandparents' garden. But I'm actually going back timeline-wise to the late 1940s, and I just think that's wonderful. They lived in their house. This was one of 2 peonies that were in that garden. They were planted in the late 40s, and when my grandparents moved in the 70s, my granddad, who was a very keen gardener, an excellent gardener, took these peonies to the house they moved to. Then, when my parents moved to this house, which I have then purchased, he planted 2 of these in the garden. And I just think that story is wonderful. And I look at this plant now when it does come through, and I just think, wow, this would have looked the same in my grandparents' gardens in the late 40s. When they were young and just starting out their family, they were quite newly married, and they were living in a very different time to what we live in now. It's an absolutely beautiful plant. I don't always get to see it because very often as it comes into flower, our weather turns, particularly windy. We catch the wind in the front garden here, so very often it's battered and I don't get to see the beauty of it. But this year, it's actually, the weather's pretty good and it's opening up better than it usually does. And I look at this plant every year. I absolutely love it. If I move, it will go with me. It's like receiving a beautiful gift from my grandparents every year.